Please welcome Alex Hamilton from eCommera, Isobar Commerce.
Where? Alex! Where's my friend Alex? Oh, you're coming from the other side. That's sneaky. I like you. I like outliers.
Good.
You need a clicker,
I
I guess.
do, yeah. Thank you
Here
very
you go.
much. Cheers.
Have fun.
Thank you.
The stage is yours.
Cheers. Good afternoon. Hello. I'm Alex, Head of Insight from eCommera. And I'm here today to talk to you about productivity. Bit of a word that a lot of people don't like discussing. My background is as an economist. I then moved into retail consultancy and then into retail tech. So I look at everything through an economic lens. And today's been a lot of talk around VR, AR, driverless cars, artificial intelligence, and it will have resonance in the future and now, for sure. But for me, the fundamental problem in the global economy, in society, is our lack of productivity since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. So I'm going to take you through that today for about 10 minutes and give my thoughts and my views, and then give you some industry context around retail and brands. Quickly about eCommera, so we are a retail solutions business. We offer systems integration on demandware and also consultancy, so helping brands and businesses make more money via e-commerce, essentially by offering their customers a better customer experience, and those are some of our clients. Now, for my presentation, so firstly, I'm going to outline the problem around productivity and why I think it's one of the major problems affecting society, and why I think that from a tech perspective, it's something that we should be focusing on in a lot of detail. I'll outline the why, so why is this happening at this time? Why did the financial crisis trigger such a dramatic drop in productivity? And finally, give you some industry context around retail and brands, and the conversations that I have with retailers on a daily basis and what they're telling me in those meetings. So firstly, the problem. So in a nutshell, the problem is that since the financial crisis in 2008, productivity as measured by output per worker, output measured by gross domestic product, has slumped dramatically. An example in the UK, for instance, is that employment in the UK is a record employment, more than any time in history. However, the amount of output that employment creates is severely limited. And it's an interesting quote from John Maynard Keynes. Any economist in the room will understand this. He said that by 2029, he wrote this in 1929, by 2029, we'd only work an average of 16 hours per week, which obviously isn't the case. And this chart here kind of explains those productivity issues that I'm talking about. So this blue line here is output per worker, so the measure of productivity of our society, of our economy. This dotted line that goes up, that's the long run trend. That's where we should be. And this red line here is UK interest rates, and that's the sharp drop there is the financial crisis when we had to respond with monetary stimulus. And as you can see from that, since the financial crisis, this blue line representing productivity growth has flatlined. We are not growing productively as a society, as an economy. And the gap between where we are and we should be is about 15%. Now that's a fundamental problem because that impacts our living standards. The idea is that if we're more productive as a society, we create more output, we create more jobs, we progress in terms of living standards. So for me, when I look at all this tech out there and what it can do, I always go back to this. Will it solve a productivity problem? When I talk to retailers, I say, will it make your business more efficient? Because this is the fundamental problem impacting our global economy. Like I said, it's not just the UK, it's the global economy. So here's a paper published by the IMF quite recently. Check it out. If you type in IMF productivity on Google, it will come out. Very cool read. I'm an economist, so I'm going to think it's cool. But it is very cool. And as you can see, advanced economies, emerging market economies, and then low-income economies. The yellow line is where we should be. The blue line is where we're at. So it's not just a UK issue or a European issue. It's just a global problem that's been started from the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And the reason why now I think it's the most important time to discuss this is because up until now we've seen the mobile phones, the smartphones, been the biggest tech evolution the past decade, social personalization, all these different tools that have kind of risen to accommodate these new tech concepts. But going forward, we have AI, cloud computing, driverless cars, machine learning. So I think for me, we're going to see some big tech gains on the back of that, but I'll discuss that in a second. But another decade of weak productivity growth, like we've seen for the past 10 years, it doesn't matter what we're going to do tech-wise. If we can't correct this problem, our living standards aren't going to grow. I'm going to improve. And ultimately, for me, that's what tech's about. Tech's about improving the living situations of people, improving consumer, improving the customer experience, for example. That's what all tech should be focused around from a retail perspective, which is my sector. So that's the problem. Now I'm going to discuss briefly the why. So why is this problem occurring? Why was the financial crisis, at that moment, why did productivity just go into the doldrums? So for me, there's 3 reasons. And again, this is an area that a lot of academics are still looking into. As I mentioned, this IMF paper that was released quite recently, it's a call to action for academics and for businesses and for startups to try and work out this problem and solve this problem. But for me, there's 3 kind of overarching trends which this impacts. Firstly, the financial crisis legacy. So the severity of the financial crisis was like we've never seen that before in modern history. We've seen recessions that are longer, but the rate at which the decline happened is unique in economic history. And therefore, we're in this pattern whereby businesses aren't as willing as much to invest in R&D. Interest rates are still very low. I know in Bulgaria, before the crisis, it was 5.77. Now it's 0%. There's no desire for risk appetite from a lot of these big businesses. You may say, well, what about Facebook, Google, these businesses as well? That brings me to my next point. So tech, innovation, and diffusion. So the way I see it, and the way I look back, academics see it, is that we have, say, 5% of the tech community that are really innovating. Your Amazons, your Googles, your startups that get in big rounds of investment. They're really pioneering technology and how it can be applied to customers and how it can be applied to solving this kind of productivity issue or challenge. The problem we're having, though, is that there's a lot of lagging companies. So in my previous job, my main role was to advise startups and tech companies on how they can communicate better to retailers, how they can go to them and say, we can help you solve a problem. Because one of the biggest issues for retailers and brands is they get bombarded from suppliers and startups who don't really understand the problems they're facing, don't really understand that they have a 20-year-old legacy IT system that you can promote all the fancy front-end technology you want, but it's not going to fit into that ecosystem, into that environment. And my biggest concern is that as the customer changes so quickly, as retailers and brands who sell to those customers try to evolve their offering, the supplier community as well and the tech community is trying to think about how well are we positioned, how we selling into these businesses. So my previous job, that was my big challenge, my big responsibility, was to talk to startups and talk to businesses and say, you shouldn't be focused on this, you should be focused on that. So for me, that kind of tech diffusion and tech innovation is kind of in that 5% of large kind of big companies and your kind of nimble startups. But there's a lot in terms of these current big tech companies that don't actually know what their purpose is within this new tech landscape. Off the back of that as well, with interest rates being so low, there's a lot of zombie companies that are around. A lot of companies that can refinance very easily because interest rates are so low. And they're just stuck in this productivity quagmire. And there's no evidence of that ever ending soon with interest rates across the globe, generally speaking, pretty reduced. And finally, the skills gaps. For me, it's a really interesting point. So any retail CEO I meet, or head of e-com, or head of digital around Europe, one of their biggest challenges is having the people with the right skills in the business to enable tech change. That's one of the biggest bugbears. You can have a conversation about CRM, you can have a conversation about personalization or about AR. What it comes down to, when you throw up, have you got the right people to deliver this? Generally speaking, the answer is no. That's a big issue for my market, the UK, but in Europe in general, and also in the US. So those are kind of 3 considerations to bear in mind, that the reason why I think that the drop in productivity has been so severe. Another interesting idea that's been kind of circulated by academics, and one that I firmly believe in based on my experience, is that the smartphone is the biggest, as mentioned earlier, the biggest tech push or evolution of the past 10 years. From a consumer perspective, it drives great efficiencies for our life. It's convenient. We can order Ubers, we can order Airbnb, we can shop on Amazon in a click of a button. But in terms of how that relates to workforce performance, I'm not too sure. I can imagine everyone in this room, you probably spend a good chunk of your time at work on your phone, and 5 years ago that wouldn't be the case. I can imagine your phone on WhatsApp, on Instagram, and the younger generation probably more so. So for me, that's an interesting question that a lot of economists and academics are trying to understand. They're trying to understand, is the fact the smartphone is an enabler in a lot of ways actually an inhibitor when it comes to workforce productivity? And ultimately, workforce productivity drives the overall economy and economic performance. Interesting idea. There's a lot of papers and ideas generated online about that, so it's worth checking out. The kind of counter-argument to this, and one that I've started reading a lot about at the moment, is around measuring the output of the digital economy. How do you measure peer-to-peer engagement? How do you measure that? How do you measure the impact on society on output of all this new tech that's emerging? Or how do you kind of change the way in which you measure? So during my economics days, so I joined 2 days before Lehman Brothers collapsed, my economics firm. So I was kind of thrust into this crazy world of financial crisis. What we found was 2 years after the crisis really hit, we were on Google Trends. We were finding new ways in which to measure economic performance. And we were on Google Trends, and we were kind of playing around with that. And what we did was we typed in foreclosure in the US. So the US was a subprime crisis in the US was the event that started this chain reaction of the global financial crisis. So we typed in foreclosure, and we found the amount of people that have been Googling foreclosure over a given period of time. We mapped that against official foreclosure rates, and that Google Trends index had a 4-month leading impact on official data. So in a nutshell, you could have gone back, if we could use that back in time before the crisis, we could have seen a subprime crisis happened by using Google Trends. So for me, it's an interesting way in which technology has evolved to actually help us understand the future with a bit more clarity, which essentially is what we're all here today to understand is the future. So as I mentioned earlier, for me, the past 10 years, I talked to a retailer, it's all about personalization. I think if I asked everyone here what personalization was, you would all give different answers. Same for retailers. You ask every single retailer I speak with, personalization means something different to them. So for the past 10 years, it's been mobile, personalization, social commerce, all these different tech concepts, shall we say, come to the fore, and retailers try to understand what they mean for their business. And that's great at the front end, but it hasn't got much application at the back end. And ultimately, to do all the front end stuff, so the AR, the VR, you need to have your back end IT infrastructure sorted and up to speed. In that instance, there's a business called ShopDirect in the UK, and the reason why they're successful as a business, they're killing it in the UK, is because they're a catalogue business first and foremost. They didn't have stores, catalogue business. And what they did was they took that catalogue business, which had all this information on consumers, and they put it online, and they're a pure play business. And that's the reason why they're successful, because they didn't have that legacy IT infrastructure that a lot of brands and retailers have. So for me, the next 10 years, AI, machine learning, cloud computing, all really interesting examples of the ways in which we can claw back that productivity gap and make our back-end systems, the supply chain, more efficient. So for me, whenever you're having these conversations with retailers or brands, if you're a startup, think about this, think about efficiency, think about kind of productivity and how you can drive that for your clients. So the last 5 minutes, I want to talk about, give some industry context. So again, I work in retail, so that's my market. So going to see European retailers, helping them understand the future, helping them understand what they should be doing with their customer experience, for instance. So we ran a study quite recently of European retailers, and we found that productivity had moved up the ballroom agenda in the past 10 years. 56% agree with that, and only 7% said they'd gone down on their agenda. And I was at a round table quite recently, I was hosting it, it was UK retail CEOs. I said to them, what are you more concerned about? Brexit, which I hate, by the way. I'm glad I have a platform to say that. Or productivity. What are your biggest concerns? There was 12 retail CEOs. They all said productivity. Brexit is a fundamental way in which the UK is going to do business with the world. It's a fundamental shift in the way in which the UK will do business with the world. But if we can't fix this productivity issue and making our workforce more productive and our society more productive to raise living standards, then Brexit doesn't necessarily matter. Another example, Black Friday in the UK 3 years ago, Black Friday kind of came across the pond from the US to the UK, and it was all about the store, and retailers weren't ready, so there was people running into the store, smashing things up, cheerleading, it was crazy. The year after, everyone, all the retailers kind of put a lot of infrastructure into store, spent a lot of money on security, for example. When it came down to it, consumers went online between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. to take advantage of deals. So that, for me, is an illustration of a way in which a retail business or a brand is struggling, because one year the consumer's like, all in store, okay, we'll invest lots of money in store. Next year, customer goes online. And therefore, that money they spent in store then becomes an inefficient allocation of resources. So an example of the way in which the customer is kind of changing the way in which brands need to react and respond. And any startups or tech businesses in the room, that's what you should be thinking about, helping guide these retail businesses through the next 2-3 years. So the way in which I see it from a productivity standpoint, there's two pressures on retailers and brands at the moment, mainly in Europe, but also globally, in the US in particular. There's two things. There's mounting cost pressures. So whether that's from business rates, whether that's from wage increases, rent, whether that's from IT, distribution, there's a lot more cost now in retail, which is already a relatively thin margin industry. So retail's been squeezed on this end. And the second point is they've been squeezed by customer expectations. So the customer is more demanding. That example I gave of Black Friday just recently, far more demanding. So retailers are now operating with a finite resource that's a lot smaller, and therefore they need the tech community and us to help them spend that money efficiently and productively. And finally, from this study, we found that 56% of respondents say they are hesitant to invest in new tech, but do so anyway. That's not really a positive nod towards investment in tech. That's pretty much saying we don't really know what to do, but we're gonna invest anyway. And again, my conversations with econ directors and heads of digital, when it comes down to, from a tech perspective, investment perspective, they're struggling to understand where to invest. They've got this much resource, been squeezed from cost, squeezed from kind of customer expectations and how they behave, and they're trying their best to understand what they're going to do to generate best return on investment. And again, it's our job as the supply community and startup community to help them do that. So really just to recap, I know this is a bit of a change of pace from the other talks today, but the productivity, if we as the tech community are looking to help consumers, take society forward, we need to correct this productivity issue, this productivity gap that's emerged since the crisis. When it comes to talking to retailers and brands, I'd advise to bear that in mind and try and help them kind of see the future, not 10, 15 years ahead, but the next year, the next 2 years. Because if you ask any retailer or brand about the future, they say, we don't look past our next Monday morning trading meeting. That's kind of the short-termism, and that's the reality in which they approach their business. To finally summarise, the productivity, huge issue. It's an issue that can be fixed by the digital and tech community. It's something that I'd urge you to read about and to understand, to learn. It's fascinating and is the biggest, or the most fundamental problem impacting our society today. Any questions? Drop me an email, get me on Twitter. Happy to take any questions about anything. And have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you very much.